Good evening and welcome to today's special event. My name is Pamela Ononiwu. I'm the content producer for the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. The Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was formed to raise awareness about the use of restraint in schools across the nation. Our mission is to educate the public and connect people who are dedicated to changing minds, laws, policies, and practices so that restraint and seclusion are reduced and eliminated from schools across the nation and beyond. Our vision is to see safer schools for students, teachers, and staff. Today, we are very excited to have Dr. Seanna Leath and Dr. Jamila Harris joining us for a special Black History Month interview to discuss the film Pushout, the Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools. We will be taking your questions during the interview, so feel free to post them in the chat. Also, today's event is being recorded and will be available to view or listen to later on Facebook and YouTube and as an audio podcast. Before we introduce our guest today, I want to introduce my lovely co-host, Jennifer Linton-Tidd. Jennifer is a wife, mother of 4 wonderful sons, 2 of whom are autistic, and a 30-year political activist who makes the world more inclusive and just for more people. Jennifer is also ADHD and dyslexic. She's lobbied on state and federal levels, organized rallies, and civil disobedience. Committed to societal change and still believes we live in a system where people have great power. Jennifer is our Director of Advocacy here at the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I'm proud to have her as a friend and a colleague. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to introduce our guest. So we have Dr. Seanna Leath, and she uses interdisciplinary approaches in education and psychology to understand and address issues related to the holistic development of Black girls and women in the context of families, schools, and communities. Specifically, her research program focuses on addressing how race and gender identity beliefs support psychological resiliency among Black girls and exploring the influence of discrimination and stigma on a variety of outcomes among Black girls and women. And she's also the proud mother of 3 little kids. She's currently working with data on 3 different studies. So the Black College Women Socialization Study, the Black College Student Climate and Mental Health Study, and the Black Mothers Conscious Parenting Study. So Dr. Jamila Harris is our other panelist. She's a Robert Kirvan postdoctoral research associate at the Joseph C. Cornwall Center at Rutgers University, Newark. Her research primarily focuses on Black girls and how the intersections of anti-Black racism, sexism, and classism shape their daily experiences in school, with a specific emphasis on school discipline and punishment. Prior to joining the Cornwall Center, Dr. Harris worked as an associate researcher on a statewide school discipline reform study funded by the California Endowment. So welcome to both our panelists, Dr. Seanna Leath and Dr. Jamila Harris. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show the intro.
The trailer.
The trailer for the documentary film.
Okay, and so, all right, I'm removing everybody.
The criminalization of factors in their lives. Education. I would like for schools to become locations for healing so that they can become locations for learning.
These young women, they are pushing up against racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, xenophobia.
asked girls if they felt that teachers were afraid of them. And some girls will say yes, their teachers are afraid of them. And then they laugh, because why would an adult be afraid of a child?
And the word of the week is condone. Condone.
As a nation, talking about the school to prison pipeline for Black boys and Latino boys, but absent of that conversation,
What we learned, Emma?
was how girls of color and Black girls in particular were being impacted. What that then did was send the message that what's happening to girls isn't necessarily.
I apologize. We
What's crazy is that there are 300 girls.
are actually not showing the
The
film.
majority of girls here are Black, and they go through a lot. And I know they go through a lot because they're Black. They live in America.
My teacher got super duper.
Criminalization of Black girls in schools disrupts one of the most important.
I apologize because we are having some technical difficulties with sharing the screen.
Just gonna.
All right.
I'm gonna add everybody back on.
I'm going to show this. I'm going to show the thing from the beginning so everybody can see it.
Okay.
This video went viral, but incidents like this can be found throughout America. The criminalization of Black girls in schools disrupts one of the most important factors in their life.
Oh, Jen, can you add the screen to the podcast? They can see me, right? They can see this?
Yes.
Okay.
They can see it, but you can't see that. You can't see the trailer. I don't know why it's not showing the trailer.
Huh. When I enlarge the screen, is it seen?
No, I can't see it.
Can you add the screen to the broadcast?
Okay. I don't know how to do that. Let's see. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't know how to do that.
So the square in the left side,
Mm-hmm.
where you see my name and then the screen.
Yes, but it's not.
You add that to the broadcast.
Yeah. I think we. Is that it? There, I see. Now I see something. All right. All right.
Do you see it?
Yes. But
I would like for schools to become locations for healing so that they can become locations for learning.
These young women, they are pushing up against racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, xenophobia.
I've asked girls if they felt that teachers were afraid of them. And some girls will say yes, their teachers are afraid of them. And then they laugh, because why would an adult be afraid of a child?
And the word of the week is condone. Condone.
As a nation, talking about the school to prison pipeline for Black boys and Latino boys, but absent of that conversation,
What we learned, Emma?
was how girls of color and Black girls in particular were being impacted. What that then did was send the message that what's happening to girls isn't necessarily a crisis. What's crazy is that there are 300 girls in this school. Good majority of girls here are Black, and they go through a lot. And I know they go through a lot because they're Black. They
Okay, so I've been notified that it's not, you guys cannot see it. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna stop
yeah.
sharing.
Let's start. I can't figure out what's going on there, but I had it up. I did the share and it won't share. So I'm so sorry.
I think okay. Do you see that now in the corner?
I think we should
it's-
just continue. Let's just continue. I think we're
Okay.
technically not working out. Yeah. I think these ladies can.
I apologize. I
apologize. I'm embarrassed.
I wanted our
That's
audience
okay.
to be able to sort of see the trailer and see
Yeah.
what it is we're talking about today. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Where'd she go now? Oh no.
We lost her. It's a really good trailer though. I mean, it can also be, I'm pretty sure if you YouTube Pushout and look for Dr. Monique Morris, the trailer is pretty widely available. So maybe they could do that to access it as well.
Yeah. We'll definitely, she got disconnected. We'll definitely post it on our page and all our social media platforms so that anyone who's watching, if there's anyone left.
So the Pushout is a documentary film that lays out how adults and policymakers can address the needs of these Black young girls and women with positive responses that can short circuit the pervasive over punishment of Black girls. So I'm gonna go ahead and go right into the questions. So the documentary profiles Black girls, right, as they address how school-based practices have hindered but also helped them navigate their lives. For example, Dr. Monique Morris, who wrote the book and produced the documentary, stated, "I would like for schools to become locations of healing so that they can become locations for learning." Dr. Leath, any thoughts on this, and how does the film sort of unpack this?
I love that quote in the film, and I wanted to actually kind of just start. So my oldest child is 6 going on 7, and so she started kindergarten last year, and she was in a public school that was the most racially diverse school that we could find. We kind of live in the suburbs, and she'd been in preschool before she started school. And so, you know, a couple of months into school, she started coming home and she started saying that she hated school and that she was always getting in trouble and that she was sad. And I would take her out of the car in the morning to walk her into school, and she would just start crying sometimes. She was having all this anxiety. And I was back and forth, like I was in the classroom every week volunteering. Nothing would happen. I was in the classroom. Her teacher, who was an older white woman, would say like, "Oh, she's so smart. She's doing fine. She has friends, this, and this." But she called me on the first day and she mentioned that my daughter and another little girl were giving her a run for her money because they were not very compliant. And that was the exact language that she used. And this is the first kindergarten, right? And so I had a conversation with her even then. And I said, "Oh, well, we don't try to teach our kids to be compliant. Like, is she having trouble following directions? Like, what do you mean by that word?" And we continued to have where there were no particular issues necessarily with her performance or how she was, again, socially engaging with friends, but she was disliking being in that environment. And after a couple of months, by December, I pulled her. And it was so interesting because I said, "Oh, am I overreacting?" But I said, my child has never hated school. She has never cried about going to school. And so something is happening to her in that classroom that I am not witnessing, even as I am in constant communication with the teacher and other staff at the school, where it's not working for her. And we put her in a different school where she's been for the last year and a half. And it was like night and day. And I remember even going and talking to the school counselors, and they said, "Oh, well, you were several steps away from her being able to be moved away from that teacher. It sounds like it wasn't a good fit, but she would have had to undergo different counseling. And then she would have had to, we would have to pull her out for several months to see if that was actually the issue." And in the meantime, my daughter was crying before she went to school, right? And she was very clearly in distress. And so when I heard that quote that was mentioned in the documentary, this idea of education in school as a place of healing for Black girls, part of it, I think, is recognizing when harm is happening and trusting Black girls when they're saying, like, "This is what I'm experiencing." And I think even one of the young girls who first came on and the parents are talking about, the parents trusted that the teacher as a school official was taking care of their child. And in fact, that their child was having behavioral issues, then it was their daughter. And so then their daughter was feeling depressed and she wanted to run away from school, and she was, experiencing suicidal ideation early on. And so I think part of it, for me, when I think about schools as healing, in order for learning to take place, Black girls have to feel safe and they have to feel valued and they have to feel like they can fully show up in those classrooms and teachers are there for them to listen to them. And that doesn't happen nearly often enough when we see statistics on how Black girls are doing and how they're being stereotyped and criminalized in school spaces. So that's what I'll start with there, right? And I think it felt very different for me. I mean, even being a Black girl and going through schooling spaces myself, but having my child, her early entry into kindergarten, having that experience, and then having to make the decision that even though I cannot pinpoint what is going on, even though I'm asking and I'm advocating and I'm doing all the things they claim you should do in order to help your child navigate school, it was still wrong and she was still being harmed and I needed to remove her, and I had the privilege to be able to do so.
Wow, thank you for sharing about your experience with your daughter. I think it definitely matches sort of what I would sort of call, you know, the hypothesis of the film. So it's in the opening of the documentary, the film, the narrator states how the criminalization of Black girls disrupts the most important factor in their life, education. So what you just said about your daughter definitely exemplifies that. So let's look at some of the statistics. I mean, they're mind-blowing. In high school, for example, Black females are more likely to receive one or more out-of-school suspensions than white females. And then we also know that Black girls are restrained more than white female students, 3 times more. They're 2 times more likely to receive corporal punishment than white female students. Black girls are 4 times more likely to be arrested than white girls. And they're 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement than white girls. I mean, these statistics are staggering, and they shouldn't be. So, Dr. Leath, the film talks about adverse childhood experiences and how childhood trauma among Black girls and also how they're adultified in schools and beyond. You know, the statistics talk about sort of also what's going on in school, right? So the ACEs sort of refer more to the trauma, the childhood trauma, but aren't ACEs also occurring in schools, by schools, on Black girls? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, and I definitely want to pull in Dr. Harris on this question as well. I think one thing that I always want to push back against is the idea that it's staggering that we see these in-school or out-of-school suspensions or these expulsions or Black girls being physically restrained. When we think about how racism and sexism operate, we think about how Black girls are not afforded the protections that white girls and some girls from other racial and ethnic groups are, and they're not seen as children. So you mentioned adultification, which will review Black girls as physically or like chronologically or developmentally older than they actually are. And when we think about how racism operates and how protection and security and safety is not afforded to Black bodies and Black girls' bodies, they make complete sense. These statistics make sense. And so I'll let Dr. Harris jump in so she can get on the conversation, and then I could.
So I appreciate you starting out by telling a story, and I'm a storyteller and a Black feminist, so I'm going to do the same and lift the stories of the Black girls who have trusted me to do this work. And I of course like to start out with a story of Tiara, who is a 12th grade Black girl in Southern California, who has navigated so many different systems, including the foster care system. And she tells the story about how Black girls aren't allowed to have bad days in school. And so she talked to me about how navigating the foster care system just really affected her mental health. And she hadn't realized that she had actually been experiencing depression. And because of this, she became very disengaged in school. She was once the straight A student and had been on the cheer team and so forth, and was deeply engaged in school. But after being separated from her mother, she had the experience of going into foster care homes that she didn't feel safe at nighttime. And she had a younger sister and was looking out for her younger sister. And so many days she stopped going to school altogether. But rather than reaching out to her and really figuring out ways to reconnect Tiara to interventions and to mental health services in school, she was often policed for her facial expressions in the classroom. Her teacher would stop by her desk and tell her that she looked angry or upset. And so each day this became a deeper and deeper hostile space for her, where she was already navigating challenges in her own personal life. and then to come to this space where she had once been a very deeply engaged student, to now be criminalized for the ways that she was responding to trauma in her own life, was something that she shared with me as a factor that had contributed to her own push out into the criminal legal system. And this is a narrative that we know runs true for Black girls across the board. We see that girls who face the greatest levels of social inequities and vulnerabilities, including homelessness, which was lifted up in the film, foster care, sexual abuse, we see that they are disproportionately likely to be suspended, and also students who are identified as having learning disabilities and so forth. These students who are multiply marginalized are often targeted by punitive policies when educators are missing critical opportunities to leverage resources to reconnect these students and to really get them the support. And we also see this paralleled in the criminal legal system. When we look at the number of women and girls who are incarcerated that have experienced sexual violence in their own lives, it's embarrassing that we can even use the word criminal justice system to talk about what we're doing to these girls and women who have already just navigated so many assaults on their bodies. And so I think that the film really uplifts this narrative and how educators are missing opportunities to support Black girls who are navigating so many different intersectional violences in their own lives. And especially with Black girls, we know that this is mirrored in their representation among punitive discipline outcomes as well as criminal legal system patterns.
I love what Dr. Harris said about Black girls not being able to have a bad day, or Black girls not being able to frown. And I think the film really talked about, a number of the young women talked about feeling angry and justifiably angry for what they were experiencing, whether they was being bullied in school by teachers or, again, experiencing trauma related to foster care, other experiences. And I think that's something that Black girls and women being able to have the language to be able to be enraged, to be able to feel anger, and still also be afforded safety and protection for someone to ask them what is going on, or to be able to have a range of emotions, anxiety and depression. What does that look like in Black girls, and how are we talking with them about these things? And I don't think that's happening in enough schools, right? When we see all these cases of these little elementary school girls, or these 9-year-olds or 15-year-olds being flipped over in desks or being arrested or pepper sprayed, and knowing that maybe they were having sleeping issues, or they were just having a child tantrum. They were not able to respond to the stimuli in their environment. They were responding in a way that makes sense developmentally, but the response to them is not developmentally appropriate, and it is, in fact, physically harmful. And again, we see this pattern happen again and again and again. We say, how could this happen? Why?
You know, I was in the book, I read the book by Monique Morris, Pushout. And I was wondering if one of you wanted to explain the good girl, bad girl dichotomy.
Ooh, I'd be happy to start out with that. Yeah, well, Monique Morris, she talks about good girl, bad girl dichotomy. I also want to lift up Nikki Jones, who work really fundamentally guides my own research between good and ghetto. And so it looks at the ways that Black girls are positioned along this normative hierarchy of feminine standards that assess their femininity against white, normative, middle-class, bourgeois feminine norms. And so we know that Black girls who are considered to be in deviance of white normative femininity are often positioned as criminal and as violators of gender norms in the school context. And when we look specifically at the between good and ghetto paradigm, we know that this not only affects Black girls' experiences with regard to their interactions with adults in school, but it also affects their experiences when we're thinking about their interactions with police officers. And so this all ties back into the adultification of Black girls, but it also ties into the workings of patriarchy and sexism, and how girls who are not read as fragile or gentle are deemed not worthy of protection. And so we see this especially play out in the ways that Black girls who are considered to be non-gender conforming, non-binary Black girls who are involved in behaviors that are deemed more masculine, such as being involved in physical fights, can be subject to more egregious forms of punishment because they are not deemed to be girl-like or innocent. And a lot of that is really structured around white normative femininity as the baseline.
And so Dr. Harris, thank you for getting us beautifully, you said started, but like you were in there. When we think about the sexual objectification of Black girls, right? When we think about even the cases with R. Kelly, for instance, and how a number, the population and the public for years saying those girls knew what they were doing. They were egging on, or they were, responsible for what happened to them. Or we think about, again, so the idea that white girls are presumed to be innocent and are presumed to be damsels in distress and are presumed to need protection. When we think about the case of Amy Cooper, Christian Cooper in Central Park in New York, where she called the police and she was hysterical. And she said, this Black man is threatening me. And he videoed it. And the assumption of like, if that video was not available, would they have assumed that in fact that white woman did need to be protected? And then the assumption for bad girls, like bad girl status being automatically placed on Black women and Black girls' bodies, and Black girls then being assumed to be women while they are still children, and how we do not then protect them from sexual objectification or sexual harassment or sexual violence, and kind of assume or place the assumption that they, again, deserved what happened to them. I think the last thing I want to mention about kind of this, if we, move on, is when we see, for instance, work in educational spaces where Black girls' engagement comes up, in the classroom when they're raising their hand or their answer maybe before questions have been finished being asked, where they're like, oh, you have, again, this deviance, this notion of your engagement is defiant, or you're talking back, or you have an attitude. Again, these negative assumptions of how Black girls might just be trying to be excited about learning or about being in that educational space. And again, rethinking how we're viewing their behaviors. That's what I'll say on that.
I think this is all great. This is so amazing. There are a couple of things that I was reminded of from the film while you ladies were talking. One of the quotes was by Miss Vivian Anderson, and she's from Every Black Girl Inc. And she said, all kids go through things, but not all kids are treated the same way. So when they go through those things, how are they treated? And it's exactly as you guys were saying, like white girls are seen as damsels in distress and they need rescuing and protection. Mm-hmm. Whereas Black girls, you can fend for yourself. You're okay. And there's a lot of statistics and research to back that up, that Black girls are seen as not needing protection, as being able to fend for themselves. And then also, it was interesting that Dr. Ronald Dahl, who's a medical doctor from UCLA, what he said about the Black girls experiencing puberty at a younger age, but he emphasized, but they're still girls, right? And so that is important to note. You may see a 9-year-old girl who's budding or whatever, but she's still a little girl, especially up here. And so we should treat them as such in their developmental stage. So, I mean, it's so important that we have this conversation. I'm so glad you guys are here. So on the topic of trauma, right? In the trailer that we sort of didn't see, but there was a young Black girl, and I hope that you guys will go back later, our audience, and watch the trailer. It's available on YouTube, and we are going to post it. We see a young Black girl who slammed to the ground, literally pulled out of her desk, out of her chair, and slammed to the ground by a school resource officer. So Dr. Harris, I'm wondering, can you talk about how Black girls experienced race-based PTSD when their bodies are criminalized, and sort of talk about your state-sanctioned violence research?
Definitely. And actually, one of the narratives that Dr. Morris lifts up in the film and in the book was a narrative of a Black girl who actually went to my high school, Plesia Mervin. She had been slammed to a lunch table after, quote unquote, refusing to pick up birthday cake from the floor by a school security officer, and in the process, her wrist was injured. And that happened the year before I began high school. at the school. And so witnessing that in the media had actually really catalyzed my introduction into looking at the experiences of Black girls, and specifically looking at Black girls' experiences with criminalization. Oftentimes when we're thinking about narratives of police brutality, even within the Black Lives Matter movement, Black girls are obscured from those discussions, and we would like to think that these notions of girlhood that are commonly associated with gentility means that Black girls can be protected. But one of the things that I found from my study was that Black girls have an astute awareness that their Blackness denies them the protections of their girlhood, especially when interacting with police. And so I wrote an op-ed that was called Why Black Girls Can't Wait for Police-Free Schools, in which I talk about Black girls' narratives of the emotional impact that witnessing police violence in their school context, not talking about in their neighborhoods, but on school grounds, has on their daily lives as students, and their ability to engage in the educational setting. And so I just want to quickly define race-based traumatic stress as a form of stress that implies that individuals who are people of color are experiencing charged discrimination as traumatic, and these kinds of discrimination often generate responses similar to post-traumatic stress. And so what I found in my research, when I asked the very open-ended question, what is a policy or punishment that girls from your race or gender group experience that no other girls experience in the school setting, to understand how girls were making sense of discipline inequities based on their own lived experience. And these were all girls who themselves had multiple encounters of school punishment across the board. Of all 20 girls that I interviewed, they lifted up state violence, police brutality, and extra legal force by school security as the punishment that they had never witnessed another girl experience. Though they could name Black boys and Latino boys as boys who had been physically assaulted by police officers and school security officers, they had never witnessed any other girl of color or white girl in the school that had been physically assaulted by school police. And this is a study that's taken place in California, where there's no kind of provision around school security using extra legal force or school police using pepper spray to subdue students and physically violating students in such a way. And so one of the things that consistently came up when girls were describing these encounters was that they were describing emotional and bodily reactions to witnessing these encounters. I had one girl who was in 12th grade who said to me that she saw a police officer pepper spray a student and had a flashback of a pregnant Black woman being killed by police.
Oh my God.
And that was just such a vivid image to sit there with that 12th grade Black girl and to hear her utter the words that she was reminded of a video of a pregnant Black woman being killed by police. I think really just illuminates the ways that these students who are now being forced to grapple with just so many egregious forms of state violence through social media. And now, especially now that we are in remote instruction, this is often the ways that they are maintaining contact with their friends, the ways that they're maintaining their social bonds and relationships. At the same time, they are being inundated with Black death and inundated with state-sanctioned violence, but they're also being inundated with messages that reaffirm what they already understand, which is that being a girl does not protect them from being assaulted or killed by police, even if they are on the premises of their own school property. And so research has largely found that prevention of trauma and responses should revolve around trained counselors and grief specialists. And we also know that police officers, when they are in schools, can incite even further violence, and that educators who know that police officers are present on campus will over-rely on these administrators. And so on these police officers instead of using actual administrators in the school on the school property. And so really, I think that this just kind of illuminates why There's been such a clarion call among Black girl organizers across the nation who have been really driving this push to abolish school police. And we're seeing that in school districts in Oakland, Florida, Los Angeles, that Black girls are really leading this movement, calling that we sever our education system from its linkages with the carceral system and stop police officers from being allowed on the premise. And that is especially in schools that are concentrated in communities, poor communities of color, where we are seeing that they are already experiencing just heightened levels of over-policing and in such indignified ways that their schools are often even more concentrated and affected by police violence.
I want to bring up just a small thing, kind of tagging the end of some of Dr. Harris's points, that even as we talk about Black girls, like always recognizing that we're not a monolith, right? And then also recognizing, like when I was watching the film and I was listening to a few of the young women's initial stories, I was thinking about colorism, and I was thinking about the differential effects of school discipline or potential suspension or harm against darker skin tone Black girls compared to lighter skin, or again, thinking about when you are closer to whiteness, potentially in skin tone and pigment, right? And how in some cases that can afford you certain privileges or bodily protection, or lifting up Black girls who might be larger in body, or lifting up Black girls who are neurodiverse. And so thinking again about the intersections of what makes us vulnerable to violence in schools and what can make schools, not safe spaces. And I think a lot of my work has focused on Black undergraduate women, and a number of them have been from families with higher parental education status, or they're not the first in their family to go to college. Now, a number of these young women are, but they've made it, they've accessed higher education in some format, right? And so in one of my recent studies, I talked with them specifically about the socialization they'd received from their mothers around state-sanctioned violence. And one of the findings from that paper was that a number of the young women said, my mother assumed that I wouldn't experience state-sanctioned violence, right? And I think, so there weren't conversations in my home necessarily. Like there was no proximity to police. We lived in the suburbs. I went to private school. And again, so there's two important points there that I want to say now. One of my old mentors used to say that it's an illusion to assume that you are in a Black body and you are safe. It is an illusion to think that just because you go to a suburban school, for instance, and there are no police officers at your school, that at some point you might not experience violence against your body just for being the person you are, right? So you can hold that belief, but it is not true. And I think Kimberly Crenshaw, she has this amazing podcast called Intersectionality Matters. And a number of the women, the mothers, let's say her name, who have lost their daughters to state-sanctioned police violence, some of them talk about, like, I never thought it would happen to me. And if I had heard my daughter's story, I would have assumed that, that was something wrong that she was doing. So it might seem like a bit of a tangent, but again, like referring back to my research, it was interesting to hear these young women say, like, actually, I realized that my mom was wrong, or that my parents were wrong. And actually, I could experience this violence myself, or I witnessed other girls in my school experience this. And I recognize that, like, we're in this together. And so speaking to Dr. Harris mentioned the civic engagement and the political activism among youth that we see, and among Black women and girls in particular. And I think the second point, just the importance, again, of recognizing the vulnerabilities within our population, right? And not, again, thinking that, I remember the story of, Ayanna Dior, a Black trans woman who was harmed during a Black Lives Matter activist protest by Black cisgender men, and what that means. So again, a lot of these conversations have to be nuanced by the intersectional identities that we hold. And so I wanted to just take a moment to spotlight that as well during this conversation.
Jen, do you want to add anything to that? Oh, she's on mute.
You're muted.
Jen, you're muted.
So a lot of restraint and seclusion and the discipline gap is also on neurodivergent children. Can either of you speak to the intersection of neurodiversity and Black girls?
Okay, so at this point in time, and a lot of my work, I can't, right? I think that there's one particular paper where we talked to Black mothers who had boys and girls who were moving from kindergarten to first grade. And one of the themes that came up was that mothers were concerned that either their sons in particular would be recommended for special education instead of receiving other services that they needed, maybe around like vision or hearing, or again, just delays in reading, for instance, and instead they would just be placed in special education and kind of misrecognized and not given access to the educational services that they required. And again, it spoke to this misrecognizing Black kids' strengths, right? And not seeing them for who they are and kind of putting them in this particular box. But I think beyond that, one of the calls in that paper was to explore more neurodiversity among Black populations and to make sure that when we're having these conversations, that it's not relegating Black boys or Black girls to ADHD or to ODD, which relates to like offensive defiant disorder. I think it's like that. I think I'll mention just a brief story, which again, may not speak to it, but I recently, I'm in the middle actually of having my oldest son, who's 5, kind of diagnosed by developmental specialists. And we had to send a form into his school. And I remember as I was sending the form in, which was actually this morning, I wanted to tell his teachers, and we have a generally good relationship, but his teachers in his classroom are both white. I wanted to say, like, pretend you're filling this out for like a little white boy when you're rating his aggressive behaviors, or whether he's, like on a motor and he's moving so quickly through the classroom or he can't calm down. Like, I want you to somehow perceive him differently because, again, you're doing this formal assessment for my son. And the doc, even when I called originally and they have our form up, they said, "Oh, do you think it's ADHD?" And I was like, actually, no, I don't. Like, I did not say he has attention issues or he's moving or any of the things that my brother has ADHD and was diagnosed at 7. No, I think it's something else. And I want to make sure that when you're assessing him, you're looking at this full profile of what could be happening and not going to this specific kind of diagnosis, which is not bad in and of itself. But again, just speaking to considering the full range of options and making sure that if my son does need some assistance in some way, that he receives it and I don't have to go through so many hoops. And I think that's another thing that the mothers in that particular study I mentioned, again, with their kindergarten and first grade, there were also moms who said, I can't access services in education. Like, I'm having to fight so hard to get my son or my daughter these services. I had to change schools. I had to go in and meet with principals and other school boards before I even enter my child in another school because my previous experiences were so negative and so harmful. One mother talked about, she was against stereotype as being angry because she'd been working for a year to get her son the services that he needed. And they were moving from kindergarten to first grade. This was their entry to public school education, right? Like, this was kind of setting the tone for what these parents also expected to have to go through. So I can't speak to it as much as I would love to. But
No, but that's really good. And I think it does highlight what the Black experience is for this intersectional topic of, sort of neurodivergence and going through the school system and getting services that you need. It's so prevalent, so many of these issues, right? Just as you talked about, like, making sure that when you're filling out the rating form, be objective, like presume competence, right? And really talk about the whole picture, not just what you think. And you mentioned something in there about the perception of angry, and that is so tied to Black children, Black girls, any little things like, oh, you have an attitude, you're defensive, why are you so angry? And then it's like the angry Black girl. And so that is so important for us to really discuss, because that feeds into some of this violence, because we have to remember when these things are happening, right? When we see the school resource officer come and slam a girl to the ground, it was referred to the school resource officer somewhere along that line. The school resource officer was not aware that this was happening unless they were called. So who made the call?
Yeah,
the teacher made the call to come to the classroom. So it's not just like the school resource officer, it's the whole system, right? Like, whenever the teacher, quote unquote, feels threatened, they're pushing the button. They're calling for backup. They're getting the walkie-talkie. We have a situation here, whatever the case may be. So we have to remember this. And it just reminds me of what Ms. Davis of Oakland Unified School District says in the documentary. She said, if you're not here for students, you're in the wrong place, right? So if you're not here for the students, why are you here, is what she says. And then I also wanted to point out what you said about how more vulnerable or prone to being sort of discriminated against or your body being policed if you have a darker skin tone, if you are more overweight, because again, that feeds into the whole narrative of you are perceived as somehow being more threatening and scarier, more aggressive. I mean, I can tell you as a darker skinned person myself, and having a daughter with that, a darker skin tone, she was called dark chocolate in school. She was told, go back where you come from, sort of thing. And it's perceived as being something other than what she is. And so it's very problematic. And then, there's something else that Dr. Moore says that is just the crux of this. It shouldn't be that radical to expect teachers to care about you. It's not a radical thing. It's quite simple, right? And so I think that should be the expectations that we should care about our children, our Black girls. I want to real quick here. I see that Miss Beth Tolley, who's also on our works with us here, has a question. And so she says, what do you think is the best way to help people recognize the fact that so much judgment, which needs to go, by the way, is based on white culture and not on objective facts? Thanks for the question, Beth. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think that there were a number of think pieces, particularly over the summer, that came out about, what do you do if you want to start educating yourself and not putting the emotional or intellectual labor, on Black people or on Black communities to learn about white supremacy and learn about this in educational settings, or more broadly when we think about, state-sanctioned violence. And there were a number of reading lists, for instance, that, if you wanted to start. I wish to pull up the question real quick.
I didn't want to interrupt Dr. Harris.
I think some of what we usually see, particularly in educational spaces, is we're going to do this one-off workshop or this one-off training where we're going to do diversity training, or we're going to do professional development for teachers and help them recognize their inherent biases. And there have been a number of scholars, Black scholars, and other educators of color who have been writing about this for decades, about that we know what to do. We know that we need, ongoing, consistent professional development training. And we think about judgment, when we think about teacher stereotypical bias, we needed to also go against multiple levels, right? So you all mentioned that it's not just school resource officers, it's teachers, and then it's principals, and it's other leaders within the school, and it's the school board, and it's the policies and practices. We think about dress code policies that harm Black girls, for instance, and addressing those policies. And so I think it's a multi-tiered problem. It's something that, requires long-term change. There's this excellent podcast that talks about, not looking for quick fixes when we're talking about educational equity. I also think that I always call it, anytime there's a conversation about objectivity in research or otherwise, I'm always our realities are subjective. I always question objectivity. The questions we ask, how we approach or see Black girls or Black women in school settings, how we choose to respond to any particular behaviors, how we write about them, how we think about them, how we engage with them in the world, it's all subjective. And when I'm going to stop there for now. I'm going to pause in case Dr. Harris wants to jump in.
Yeah, I echo everything that Dr. Leath just shared. I'm a little less optimistic because I having been involved with just so much work that's looking at school reform and to see even within the criminal legal system, within the carceral system, that so much of the reasons why people are incarcerated relate to white judgment and constructions around criminality that are really predicated on how white people construct ideas of criminality. And so I think that there's a deeper conversation about how do we get people to be willing to proactively work against white supremacy and to proactively work against anti-Black racist ideologies that structure punishment systems and that structure ideas around who is considered and read as criminal. And so I think that a lot of that work can be done a lot of that work can be supplemented with readings and trainings. But I think that fundamentally, if we're not talking specifically about anti-Black racism, if we're not talking specifically about white supremacy and how policies, practices, and ideas are upholding anti-Black racism and white supremacy, that we will continue to fall short. But I want to echo again that work can't fall on the backs of Black people, and can't fall on the backs of Black educators or Black women specifically. But I think that there has to be a willingness, and especially that work has to be enforced systemic at the system level. We're seeing a lot of times that these kinds of programs and professional development trainings are implemented, and certain teachers who are already engaged and interested in doing anti-racist work show up, but those who don't really care and are kind of in denial about how their own privilege and power affects their practices don't show up. And so what does it look like to have an intervention and a professional learning opportunity that is systematically enforced, so that all teachers and educators and staff members are required to be a part of those very critical conversations. And I think that, a big part of that work relies on willingness to dismantle white supremacy, and that work can't fall on people of color.
Yeah.
And I'm smiling because you just bring in accountability, right?
Yeah.
I think what we do not see enough of is accountability. The Capitol riots, for instance, Trump's impeachment, thinking about how many officers have actually been arrested or actually charged with the crime for killing or harming Black women and Black girls, right? In schools, actually, one of the teachers in the documentary, she said, "Oh, I realized that, some young woman in the class had triggered her with her behavior, and that, if her response to the girl was too much for the girl's behavior, then she needs to be accountable for her behavior." Now, my interesting, thought in that moment too was like, okay, you're right. As an adult, you can be triggered by a child's behavior, but you are still the adult and you still hold power in that situation. So you are not on the same level as a child, in terms of thinking about whether her behavior triggered you. But it was a moment where she was speaking to this idea of accountability. Or if you have teachers who do harmful things, like send home an assignment and say like, "Oh, I want you to talk about how plantation owners felt when they owned enslaved Black people back, before the Confederate Civil War." Like, no, they need to be held accountable for what they sent home and the harm that they did. And so I think that's also, speaking of Dr. Harris's point about not necessarily feeling optimistic, a part of the process that we have not seen in regards to white supremacy and patriarchy and the harm that we see in educational spaces for Black girls.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people who, center themselves in the spirit of victimhood to deflect taking account, and I find that a lot with, speaking white to white with white friends when I talk about, and I talk a lot about school to prison pipeline, clearly in the work I'm doing. And, it just amazes me how quickly it comes back to we're the victim somehow all of a sudden, or why are you saying that to me? Slavery ended or whatever. And it's like, it did end, but now we're here, now we've got the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration and Pushout and everything else. So it's a continuum.
Definitely.
Nothing has ended. It just changed form.
I would add on to that I think that in many ways, a lot of these different programmatic interventions and alternatives to school discipline have deflected our analysis and willingness to address anti-Black racism. I had the experience of presenting research to a school where Black girls were involved in a participatory research study, and they sat down with data. They sat down with Pushout. And they really had critical conversations about what they were understanding as the core root as to why Black girls in their high school were disproportionately suspended, one, but also were suspended at the highest rates in the state of California. And among that conversation, this idea that Black girls were seen as more threatening, this idea that school discipline really enables teachers to enact racism through policies like kicking Black girls out for being disrespectful, and all of these broader narratives that really just reveal the underlying workings of anti-Black racism, sexism, misogynoir, which looks at the intersections of anti-Black racism, sexism, and patriarchy, were coming up as themes. And having presented this to a team of school leaders that are doing work with their school to work against discipline inequities, there was still just such a level of denial to see students' actual verbatim narrative say, this is a product of racism. There was still a denial that racism was influencing their practices, and that PBIS and all of these other interventions would help them to rectify what these girls were experiencing in their day-to-day interactions that oftentimes weren't even reflected in the quantitative data. We talk a lot about the quantitative data, but we don't talk about the ways that Black girls are also experiencing other forms of suffering that can't be quantified in the school setting, and how they are really picking up on these cues that their educators are internalizing stereotypes about them, and that their educators are racist and oftentimes anti-Black. That really just can't be something that we put together a one-size-fits-all model and say restorative justice is the perfect approach to solving systemic racism in our education system and in our punishment systems. And so I think that there has to be like I said, an accountability, but also a willingness on behalf of folks who benefit from white supremacy to proactively work to dismantle how white supremacy operates in the school system.
Yeah, you mentioning behaviorism there. Here at AASR, we are not huge fans of behaviorism because you're trying to modify the signal that there's a deeper. The behavior is a symptom. It's not. It's not what needs to be corrected. What needs to be corrected is what's causing the behavior. So I can, Pam and I have noticed in our county that the alternative learning centers are full of Black and brown children. You know, it's just another form of segregation. It's, he's emotionally disabled, or I can't remember, it's the EBD. I can't remember what the label is, but they throw them out. They don't even give them an IEP because that diet or whatever, that label doesn't get you an IEP. You just get segregated out into that alternative learning center. And it's bye-bye. Alternative learning center is segregation of 2020, or 2021.
Yeah, and also, sorry, Dr. Leath, what you mentioned earlier too about ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. So something I want to say real quick about ED, emotional disorder, and ODD is that when a child of color is giving an IEP, they somehow get it, more than likely, and there's research behind this, that most of the diagnosis or the label that's in their IEP, which is an individualized education program, is ED or ODD. Like Black kids mainly get that designation. They're not given the benefit of the doubt, like Dr. Leath was talking about, being objective in your when you're profiling the child to figure out what diagnosis is. They're not giving the benefit of doubt of other designations like ADHD or autism or anything, or learning the learning processing disorder. No, it's mainly ED or ODD that these kids, again, it's because they're seen as what? Angry. They're seen as being defiant in so many different ways, aggressive or highly emotional. And so they always label them with like ED, ODD. And I see that Beth Tolley is saying ODD is a garbage term.
I just came across, sorry.
No, go ahead. I
came across a breathtaking statistic. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. In research, as I was writing an article about the words we use about marginalized children. This won't be breathtaking for you, but 65% of juvenile incarcerated children are minors are disabled. 18.7% of our IEP special ed population are Black, but 49.9% of incarcerated disabled people are Black. So it just amazes me. And every statistic that I look at that has to do with incarceration, the Black one is way up, and it's so obviously a bias.
I wanted to mention too, one of the things.
Go ahead.
Oh, because I know we're coming up on.
Yeah.
One of the things the documentary does an excellent job, I would say, is talking about too, like, what are we pushing Black girls into when we're pushing them out of schools? Like, one, kind of debunking the idea that it makes sense to push Black girls out of educational spaces, and how dangerous that is. And we think about criminalization, or we think about potential sexual violence or sex trafficking, right? And then the other, darn it, we were talking about. I lost my thought, and it was a really good thought. If I get it back, I'm going to hopefully be able to add it in. I wanted to spotlight that.
So I wanted to say, while you're thinking, go through your thoughts. I wanted to say that in response to your statistics, Jen, about sort of the prison system and the youth and adults, it's interesting. I think they say that a lot of the youth that are in prison that are, Black, that they may have dyslexia. And so dyslexia is something that's easy to accommodate in an IEP. You can give a child tools for that. But to say that it's not dyslexia and to say that it's an emotional disorder versus actually giving them the tools of learning to read, it just doesn't make sense. And then the other thing with the film, the whole other premise of the film is how education is that great equalizer, how education will pull a child who has a whole bunch of aces out of where they and help them get through, right? And so if education is now being also criminalized on Black girls, then how will they ever make it through on the other side, right? And so I just think it's just so important that we highlight that as well. And I wanted to also talk about Lauren Christine's comment real quick. She says, "Thanks for sharing about your journey and work, Dr. Leath. I also recommend the work of Dr. Ononiwu, particularly her book, The Pedagogy of Pathologization, Disabled Girls of Color in the School Prison Nexus."
I just love Dr. Mims, who is Lauren Christine, because she is one of these beautiful friends of mine who is also a colleague and just uplift. She's wonderful. So I'm just happy to see her comment. I finally remember the comment that I was thinking. So in the documentary, when they were talking about what one of the young women was experiencing, right? And the teacher was saying she was experiencing trauma and all these things were going on at home. And so when we're talking about educational equity, we're talking about housing insecurity, and we're talking about food insecurity, and we're talking about students, Black girls' home environments and how their parents or their caregivers are doing. And so the importance of remembering that all of these issues are interconnected. And it's not just what's happening in the school site whatsoever. And a lot of times these issues can be talked about in isolation as though they're not interrelated. And the principal, the Black woman principal, I can't remember her name, but she talks about getting at the roots of behaviors, right? Getting at the root of the problem. And a lot of times the behavior you're seeing from a Black girl or from a child does not actually get at the root of the issue. And if you're criminalizing or using punitive measures for the behavior that's being exhibited, you're not understanding what's actually going on. And so I think my point, tying back to the earlier, is that many times some of these issues are out of Black girls' hands when their parents or their caregivers are experiencing, again, housing or food insecurity, or they're not able to pay bills, or not able to get their child to school on time, and then their parent is being sent, to court for truancy charges, and then they're getting fined. Like, the system itself, as Dr. Harris was saying, in many ways needs to not be reformed, but be overturned. Many school policies, and as she said, a one-size-fits-all kind of model for restorative justice won't fit either. But that was kind of my thought there too, right? That our conversation, even as we're talking about educational spaces, exists beyond the actual site of schools. And in many ways, always uplifting Black girls' agency, right? That's the other thing I loved about the documentary. Just them sharing their stories and them saying, this is how I push myself, or this is how I'm able to now verbalize what's going on with me. And this is how I was thinking earlier, and this is who I am now. And I like who, I'm developing into, and I appreciate the support that I'm getting that I was not getting before. I think that is always a part of any paper, hopefully, that I write about Black women and girls, is saying this isn't me doing this on them. This is hopefully me doing this with them. And this is all about uplifting what they are already doing in their lives. And it is phenomenal. And many times it is radical. And And that's why I love what I do.
Yeah.
So.
I can tell you guys are amazing. Do you guys have any, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I interrupt a lot. I'm ADHD. Do you guys have any final thoughts? Because we are passing our
can I say something real quick before that?
Oh,
so it was Dr. Venus Evans Winters, who's from the University of Illinois, and she said that it shouldn't be a deficit lens. The mindset or approach should be more of a strength one, right? And I think that goes to what you were saying, Dr. Leath. And she said Black girls are worthy of protection, right? And so when we sort of talk about, like when you said, Dr. Leath, about the girls linking up with other girls, I know there was a girl in particular that she said she found her place when she went to the mentorship program, and she saw other girls that have sort of been through it and they're now on the other side, and how helpful that was to her. So I think having positive interactions like such as those would help. And so I also want to say the film profiles skills and schools and organizations that are making a difference in Black girls' lives. So African American Female Excellence, Oakland Unified School District, Columbus City Preparatory School for Girls in Columbus, Ohio, National Crittenden in Portland, Oregon, SOUL or Soul, Sisters Leadership Collective in Miami, Florida, and Emerge Alameda County, which is in Alameda County, California, are all featured in the documentary. So they all discuss alternative to suspensions and expulsions, and they sort of, inculcate this community-based and more culturally appropriate response, as we were sort of talking about the community at large. And so it seems to me like these will help with the protective factors for Black girls, right? Can you guys talk just a little bit about protective factors? No.
Okay. I wasn't sure if Dr. Harris wanted to jump in because I've been talking. I know we're like closing out. There's a number of studies that talk about, race and gender identity beliefs being protective factors for Black girls, like when they have a strong sense of who they are and they're proud, for instance, of being a Black girl, and they believe themselves to be capable, competent, and smart. The importance, for instance, of parent or caregiver socialization around, again, this idea of them having self-efficacy and being strong and smart and beautiful and capable and all of these things. I think protective factors in school are things that we know for students more broadly, having positive teacher-student relationships, feeling like they're valued in the school context, not being pushed out of the school, literally, whether that's in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. I feel like there are so many times in my papers where I say, like, we know what works for students. It's just that Black girls or Black students are less likely to be able to access these things because of educational inequity and stereotypes and bias and discrimination. So it's not that we don't understand what helps students learn and thrive. It's that Black girls have less access to many of these things through no fault of their own. And so I don't know if we want to add on that, but I guess, like, if I was saying my last closing thought is, like, how radical would it be if we were sharing power with Black girls, right? If we were lifting their narratives and we were listening to them and trusting them when they tell us what they are experiencing, what they're going through. And if we provide space for them to be the complex human beings that they are and to be able to navigate that, like their social worlds and their academic worlds, and how it shouldn't take away from teachers or other folks to, again, share this power with Black girls and not the idea of empowerment, right? I think shared power is something very different. It's, again, kind of taking themselves out of the equation or their personal hurt feelings about whether maybe what they just did was racist or sexist or harmful, and saying, like, oh, let me address that. Maybe you are right. I'm sorry that I did that, and how can we move forward? So that's the last thing that I would add there for myself. Hopefully Dr. Harris has some excellent words to close us out.
Dr. Harris, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, all of that, wonderful. My work deals a lot with Black girl spaces and really reimagining the ways that we look to how Black girls are engaging and theorizing about their lived experiences within schools and within the carceral system, and how we can curate Black girl spaces as home places, as Bell Hooks would say, within school contexts. And I guess that a big part of that work, I stumbled at first because the word protective factor can mean so many different things, but a big part of that work in how Black girls are looking to our space. The Concrete Rose Project, which is the project that I've created for Black girls in my community, is that this is their home place. And so for them, a protective factor, I guess it buffers against the effects of white supremacy and anti-Black racism that seeps throughout their school environment, is to have this space where it is Black girl centered and led by adult Black women who are honoring their lived experiences and honoring their knowledge and giving them a space to just vent and be themselves and be brilliant. And so when I think about protective spaces, I think about the work of Catherine McKittrick and the work of Tamara Butler, who are talking about how we can create alternative geographies in the face of geographies of oppression and domination. When we're thinking about school as a site of domination for Black girls, the ways that we create that is through creating Black girl spaces, and that has to be intentionally centered and grounded in their intersectional identities. And so I think that a big part of my work is honoring Black girls' voices. And so my closing would be to read a quick statement that was written by the group of Black girls that I work with. And they said, "Dear teachers, we want you to know that we are more than just ghetto Black girls. You need to know your students, their background, and where they come from before judging them. Some of us are loud and love to laugh. Some are shy. Some get distracted. But not everyone's the same, and not everyone comes from the same place. So don't assume that you know us. There are things in life that can cause Black girls to act a certain way. We might have an attitude and not express what we're feeling. We're human, and sometimes we do get upset. Be a mentor, leader, or someone to comfort us. Be there when we need you. Ask us why our homework didn't get turned in before you yell at us and assume we have no potential. We try hard in your classrooms. Even when you don't understand, we always try. Take consideration of what you say because it truly matters and affects us. We are intelligent and beautiful, inspirational, devoted, independent, creative, loving, and too real. We are destined to become doctors, multi-billionaires, entrepreneurs, artists, and lawyers. We are determined to be greater than what society expects us to be because we are strengthened and empowered by our ancestors, mothers, future children, and ourselves. We are full of purpose and possibilities. We are the hidden roses." Thank you, everyone.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much. I definitely want to say, last thought, just how the movie left it with Black girls, you are sacred and you are loved. That's what I want to say. So thank you so much, Dr. Seanna Leath and Dr. Jamila Harris, for coming today. We really appreciate your time. Apologize for the technical difficulties.
No,
I'm sure
it was my fault.
Rolling. Thank you for having me. This was excellent.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Jen, do you want to have any final thoughts? Sorry, Dr. Harris.
I just feel I just want to be there. And I mean, I'm very emotional by what she just read, so I'm having a hard time thinking, but I want to be there and stand behind you, beautiful women and girls. And it breaks my heart to read these statistics, and it shouldn't be happening. And I agree that white women and white men, we have to do better. And I think that's speaking up, not acting like victims and centering ourselves when we're, faced with difficult truths. So I thank you all so much. And I'm in awe. So
don't do that because you're gonna get me going down there. I just want to say something real quick about Jennifer. I mean, she's a great ally. She's definitely in the racial justice work like nobody I've ever seen that is a white woman. So it's really amazing. And also Bobby Farmer says that was wonderful. Please thank your student, Dr. Harris. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, ladies. Okay. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I think I'm supposed to run. Yeah. I don't know. I don't remember. I'm like so emo now. Thank you everyone for coming. And Guy's never going to let me run another one again. This is the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Bye-bye.
Signing off. Thank you.
Bye-bye.